Look at my,
So look behind me and oh, yay. Nice. I wore orange.
oh, very nice.
Yeah. I was honest because we're trying to figure out where are we going to do this, and then duh, silly me, Rotterdam right behind me.
Oh,
And
and I'll
he's like,
tell you, I have,
oh, beautiful, nice,
isn't
very
that
nice.
gorgeous? I love that picture from Dry Dock. So,
Yes. Were you in that dry dock? Did you take that picture?
oh no, I didn't take this picture. I got this from one of the photogs I worked with on the Rott, but so I've had this picture since forever. They even have
Yeah,
it.
I have a lot of the pictures the photogs took simply because they could just take much better pictures than I could. So
Yeah, like this lighting is just
yeah,
spectacular. I
I
mean,
know, right? Yeah. Oh, the
you know,
beauty.
I'll tell you a really kind of a spooky story. I know that today we're talking about ghost stories on the Rott, which is a really cool subject anyway.
Yes,
But
it is.
I was on a dry dock on it was a Royal Caribbean ship. And it was before my pre-Holland America days. And I was friends with one of the photographers, and he took me down. When he went down into this dry dock area, he went down to do pictures like this of the ship. So we ended up like these pilings here, we crawled under the ship on from one side and came out the other.
You would never be able to do that today.
No, I know that. But I mean, that was, I mean, security let us go down. I mean, for obviously he had the pass and the permission from the captain to do it and from
Sure.
the workers. But yeah, it was late night. We just went down there and they let us do it. But oh my God,
Oh,
so scary. It's like like walking into the Empire State Building. It was just creepy. Oh,
yeah, I can imagine.
oh, but I did it.
Well, I'm so glad that we came up with this idea to talk about this because this is a story that is, well, the Rott is near and dear to many people's hearts. The Dutch, the country, you know, the country of Holland, they love the SS Rotterdam. And over the last couple of years, I've met a couple Dutch folks that my husband then learned, told them that I worked on the old Rotterdam, and their eyes just got really big, and they're like, wow, you worked on the Rotterdam? Like, that was a huge deal. And actually, one of them said that was a really big, I didn't realize, I knew how special it was to me, but I didn't realize in the eyes of others what a huge deal it is, especially for the Dutch, to have that experience and be able to share these stories.
Wow. I had no idea either. I mean, to have worked on the old Rott, as you know, that there's so many stories that go with it. And I think if I remember correctly, to get a contract on that ship was kind of an honor. I mean, that was a ship that did the world cruises forever, but there was just something about the Grand Dame, you know, of the Rotterdam that was just, it had the staircases that, remember that they were class separated. So that going back to those days when that was a big thing, because my grandma had sailed on the QE2, the original QE2, and they were in first class. But the steamer class, she said they had better parties, so she would take the they became friends with some of the crew who snuck them down into those old steamer class parties, and they loved it. They had such a great time. But that back in those days was very common to have first class be separate from the non-first class.
That is such a Titanic scene that you just described.
Oh my gosh, that's right. Well, they did. Well, actually, you know what? They did go to some of the crew parties. My grandma loved to dance, loved to dance, and her husband, he liked to gamble. So I think they would go their separate ways. So she would go and dance, and he would go and play in the casino.
That's awesome. Oh, yeah. I'm just thinking about all the stories that just no longer could even possibly happen now on ships because of the rules and regulations. And we had a lot of fun.
We did have a lot of fun. And, you know, it was good, clean fun. I mean, I don't think of any time of the fun that we had that I ever felt in danger of any sort. And I get,
Either.
you have continued to sail with Azamara, but as the captain's wife, it gives you a different level of stature on the ship. But think about the rules and regulations that have changed over the years as the cruise lines have improved their policies and procedures, their SOPs, and their SOPs have changed because rules were broken. But what's funny is when I was working with Norwegian from corporate side as vice president of port revenue, I used to go down and have meetings with the team, the Norwegian team, with all of their revenue officers and their executives in the office. And we used to laugh because the stuff that we did and they did, because they worked on board too years ago, we are all the reasons why the rules are in place. And
Yeah.
people try and get around the rules, but they can't because we're the ones that caused the rules to be there in the first place. You know what I mean? So don't bother trying to explain. Don't try and dig that hole and get out of it.
Yeah. But like I said, it was good, clean fun. There was never any sense of danger, at least from my perception or your perception. And I think a lot of our colleagues would agree with that. Things with media over the years, things have come to light, maybe even been skewed just based on other people's perceptions of what is happening on board. And that's unfortunate. But the rules and regulations are necessary, and they have evolved to what they are, and it is what it is. But I know it was a couple years ago, my husband called and said, yeah, I had to fire someone today. And then a few days later, yeah, I had to fire someone else. I said, that's not normal for Azamara. What's going on? And I said, what did these people do? And he told me, and I went, honey, that's not anything we would have even blinked at. I said, I'm kind of glad that I sailed back in the day, because then we really just had a lot of fun. So.
And I know you can't share with those instances where, out of respect for him and his position, and still working for Azamara. Well done, Captain's wife.
Well, thank you. I aim to please.
Well, I know that we have a couple of stories that could be considered controversial, so we will skip those for this day and move on to our purpose, which is to sit and kind of tell ghost stories from the Rotterdam.
Yay! Yeah, that's fun. It's fun. So I actually I have my one story that I'm going to share with you, but I'd really love, because I know that you and I chatted and caught up when we saw each other in Florida a couple years ago about your experiences. But back in the day when we were working, we oftentimes would just be in passing. So you would be getting off a ship and I'd be getting on, and we would, or maybe we had a couple days together where we caught up with a glass of wine and what's been going on for the last 2 years with you. And so I'm not sure I've heard all of your stories. So I would love to hear your experience when you first came on the ship.
Well, I started with Holland America, same time as you did on the Rotterdam, and then I got transferred to the Rott in Fort Lauderdale. And I remember walking up the crew gangway, because as you know, that's down on the dock, and you have to roll your own luggage up and everything else. And so I did that, and then but when I went out to call my mom was so excited, because this was the dream company I had wanted to work on for 4 years before I got hired. And so I'm out in the terminal on a payphone. Back in those days, it's a payphone system.
Yep.
And my mom's like, well, what do you think? What do you think? And I said, oh my God, this ship is haunted. I mean, Tonya, I swear I can still remember the goosebumps I experienced walking up that ship onto that gangway. I didn't know. And because I'd been with the company for only 3 weeks, I hadn't heard any of the stories. So my stories run the gamut from the lady in the elevator that was that solo single capacity elevator that was forward, that it would take you up to the bridge deck. I had that.
Yeah.
That one. Then I had the one that was the lady in the Ritz-Carlton that would come down the stairs. That was another weird one. The person in the cabin that used to complain vehemently about the next door neighbor's music playing so loud, but the music, the radios in the cabins didn't work, but they kept complaining because there was music that was playing. But the one that really got me was when it was a particular cruise when it was Easter cruise. And I remember this because I had so many kids on board. And I mentioned it to Johnny the last time I talked to him, because they had the range of kids from like 5 all the way through to 16, 17. And I used to go into the theater, and their theater was, you had the main floor, then you had the balcony, and the balcony was split by the booth, the sound control, sound lights booth. So we were sitting over on starboard side, and I would go early and would reserve the seats for all the kids and me. And I used to sit on the very end of the aisle so that the kids could, they had to go past me to go out and then come back in. So you keep track of them. And I was sitting there, the show had started, and the kids were all with me, but we had empty seats down towards the wall where the booth was. And so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I see a pair of shiny black patent leather shoes, black trousers, out of the corner of my eye on the step next to me. And so I said to the kids, I said, hey, can you guys get up? There's a man who wants to come and sit down. And they're looking at me like I've got 2 heads. They're like, what are you talking about? So there's a man who wants to, sit down. Like, Yvette, there's no man there. Like, what? Oh my God, there was no man there. So this is just really weird. And I had that sense of, it felt so real that this person was next to me. And literally the next day we were in port, and I go into the showroom because I hear someone playing the piano behind the curtain. And I'm thinking it's someone that's rehearsing from having the live orchestra or an entertainer. And so I'm sitting there, I'm kind of listening to the person, tinkle on the ivories, and I go upstage, and then there's nobody there. There's nobody there playing the piano. And I went to go talk to the cruise director about it, and because this is a story I'd never heard, and I hadn't experienced this to this point, because I had the rose water smell and the elevator lady, the ghost coming down the Ritz-Carlton at dark 30, and I obviously hadn't been in the passenger cabin hearing the music, but I, was very aware of this on an ongoing basis. So I go to tell the cruise director, who believes in ghosts, by the way, so I know that I can talk to him and not be accused of, you need to go to the medical center because you've either been drinking or what have you been smoking, And he's like, oh yeah, that's what happened. That's the ghost in the theater. Apparently he had been murdered by another crew member. It was a crew member who had been stabbed to death in the theater years.
I had not heard before.
Yeah, yep, years before, years and years, and his ghost still hung around to the theater.
Do you think that was the ghost that was next to you, the patent leather shoe ghost?
That's what I assumed was the ghost. That was one.
I had heard details of that particular one. I'd heard about the one in the Ritz-Carlton and the elevator. In fact, one of our colleagues told me a story. He was in the captain's elevator going up, and he had been doing a fair amount of drinking the night before, and he had to make the morning announcements from the bridge. So he hit that elevator, and he was just, from what I remember, he was just kind of leaning against the wall and closing his eyes and going, oh, he was not feeling great. And then suddenly he got this waft of roses. And that was his story. And I thought, gosh, I never experienced any of those things. But when I came on, and these stories are from people who do not believe in ghosts that saw things.
Yep.
Engineers, navigators, and they have been around for years. I'll tell you an interesting little story. When we went to stay on there back in 2016, when it's a hotel now, we met with the former general manager of the Rotterdam. She had moved on and was in another position in Rotterdam.
Jonathan,
we met her for lunch.
You said she's moved on. I thought,
oh no!
Ed, how was that?
I guess we do need to clarify in this conversation. No, she had moved on to a different job, but we had met her for lunch, and I asked her, I said, did you ever hear about the ghost stories on the Rotterdam? And she said, yeah, I heard something about that. And I said, but she said during the dry dock when they were overhauling her to make her a hotel, I asked, I said, did you ever have any experiences when you were working there? And she said, no, not really. But we had a lot of power outages and random noises happening during the dry dock process that people were reporting, which I thought was interesting. And then we also have another friend who is probably one of the authorities of the history of the cruise lines. His name is Peter Knago, and he's been a lecturer over the years, lecturing on the history of the cruise lines.
Never seen him before.
Yeah. Oh my God, you should see his house in California. He's gone over to India where they're scrapping these ships, and he's purchased a lot of the artwork and the furniture, and his house is just beautiful. But one of his videos that my husband and I watched, it mentions in India, it is customary when you beach a ship to cut the bow off first to release the spirits.
Oh.
And I thought, wow, I did not know that. So if there are spirits on board, it's in order for them to be released before any other work is to be done, which I thought was really interesting.
Well, I want to share a story about the Rotterdam, though. Then at the end, we'll finish off with the Rotterdam and hers. But that I have a similar story about the Rotterdam.
I was going to ask you, had you had any other experiences on any of the other ships?
The Rotterdam seems to be the one ship that I worked on that had them consistent in showing up for me. And me personally experiencing wasn't that I heard them secondhand. The only last thing I can remember from the Rotterdam from the time I was there was we were doing the cruises to Hawaii. So obviously we were docked in Hawaii and staying in Honolulu overnight. And I went one time out to the Pearl Harbor Memorial and did that whole tour. And oh my gosh, because obviously that's thousands of men had died in that day. And I remember going back to my cabin. To me, there were ghosts everywhere. You could just feel it. It was just almost palpable in their presence. And I went back to my cabin after the tour. I got back, and I remember taking a nap. And as being the youth staff, I had an inside cabin. I had no porthole, no windows. So it was, dark in the room. But if I would nap, I would always just turn a small light on, or leave the bathroom light on so that there was a glow in the room. And I remember waking up, and there was the ghost of a soldier sitting on the end of my bed. And I can remember this so vividly. And the whole idea of giving him permission to go. I'm like, please do not come home with me. I really don't need this. Can you just transition, go back from whence you came? I honor your presence and move on. But one funny story about this, because we had the smoking lounge on the Rott, which is such a cool room with cigars under the stars, whatnot. And we had Edwin Rojas was the cruise director, and Rick Starr was a comedian who used to stay with us frequently, and he was on board for this particular cruise. And Edwin and I are sitting with Rick in the smoking lounge after the show talking about these ghost stories of the ship. So a couple of days later, and Rick's just kind of sitting there taking it all in. So a couple of days later, I get this phone call in my cabin. Yvette, can you bring some of that wolfbane to my cabin? Thinking to myself, wolfbane? What the heck is wolfbane? So I was like, what are you talking about? I don't smoke. What do you want? He goes, no, the stuff that keeps the ghosts out of your room. And I said, oh, you mean sage? And he said, the wolfbane. I was like, what do you want with it? He goes, I have not slept a wink since that night that we sat up in the smoking room with you and Edmund. He goes, every night I lay there in bed with literally one eye open on the door waiting for these guys to show up. So if you can come put that sage in my room, I would really appreciate it. I get some sleep. So, oh my God.
Well, yeah. So, some people are more psychically sensitive than others, and they're going to have more experiences. And it's so interesting because I have certainly, had more experiences in the last several years. And it used to be that I was scared of that. But now I recognize everything is energy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of our yoga training. And that was, again, one of my biggest takeaways from the yoga training. And it wasn't that it was taught, but I kind of just put two and two together. And when I got home, I thought, well, if everything's energy, then it's only my perception and my reaction to that energy. And so that was one of the biggest tools for me to get past the fear of my psychic sensitivity.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And so now everything's energy. And if it's not a pleasant energy, then I just say, hey, move on. Like you did with the soldier, you honored his presence, but time to move on, buddy.
Yes. Do not tether on to me because nope, thank you. I honor you. Thank you for your service. Whatever reason you're here to be seen, I acknowledge that. But I'm not the one for you.
Right. Well, back in the day, in fact, I have to tell you,
I do want to say one last thing about the sage. I did not burn the sage because just so you know, anybody who is a captain or an engineer or someone who's in safety, fire service, I did not burn the sage. I just flipped it around the room and left him a piece of it to put over his door. Just so you know.
No, but sage has been used for centuries for clearing and clarifying areas. So, but I wanted to show you, this is an old journal from Royal Viking that my grandparents gave me.
Wow.
Somehow, how I came across it, but it came into my possession. And I carry this, when I started Holland America, I carried it with me thinking, if I have a really interesting experience, I'm going to document it in this journal. And my grandmother, who loved to dance as well, this is where our grandmothers were very much the same. She was, in fact, these set of grandparents were the ones that inspired me to want to travel the world because of the stories they would come back with on Royal Viking and all of their journeys. So I walked on the Rotterdam having heard about these stories going, I want to have an experience.
I'm going to force it. It's going to make it happen.
I know. And at that time, I guess I had to open myself up to the certain level of experiences that you were having at the time. And it got further into my contract. And at some point, I found myself getting really frustrated because I hadn't had my experience yet. And I keep hearing all these stories until one day, this was in 1995. In fact, I've got this in front of me, cabin 330. It was the cabin behind the main desk, on the main deck, on the front desk on main deck. Okay. And I asked you about that after I'd had this experience, and it was with a passenger. It wasn't an experience I had directly, but I had it through this passenger. Mm-hmm. So their names were Susan and Tony, and they were British. And they had, at the time, I think it was crew staff, they had come to my ping pong tournaments, and I had superficially gotten to know them through that activity. And we had one of the nights, it was 2 weeks before I was supposed to get off. And you remember when we had the cruise show and we had to stand outside the doors to hold back guests from going into the show lounge? So I had been assigned to do that, to hold back people while the second show was ending so they wouldn't walk in. And these folks came up to me. Susan said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Every night in my cabin, I hear music and I can't figure out where it's coming from." And I said, where's your cabin located? And she said, main deck. And I said, well, there are no lounges above or below, so that would make sense. And I said, I couldn't tell you. I said, the only thing I can think of is maybe those, and you mentioned the radios and those cabins, although I never knew they didn't work. I thought they did work.
They did, yeah.
So I said, maybe there's music filtering through the radio. I said, but there's really no way I can help you with this unless I actually go down to the cabin and see. And she said, oh, would you? And I said, sure. So on our way I completely left my post of holding people back because I thought I was only going to be in there for, a few minutes. So we enter the cabin, and when you went into the cabin, it was a twin bed on the wall. You had a desk in between and a twin size bed on the other side. And we walk in, and back on that ship, the air conditioning, if you remember, was really loud coming through the vents. Mm-hmm. And when I walked in, I thought, well, all I can hear is the air coming through the ventilation system. I don't really hear anything. And so we walked in, and I said, well, I don't hear anything. And she said, well, I don't hear anything either. And then she said, hold on, let me just try something. And then she went and sat on her bed and was concentrating. And she went, there, do you hear it? And I went, no. And she said, it's a man singing "Que Sera, Sera" right now. And she said, you don't hear that? I said, no. And then very quickly I realized I am not down here to check a radio. I may actually be having my experience that I've been asking for. Yay! Yeah. So, I'm still putting two and two together is this really? And I'm like, let me just ask her a few more questions. So she said, my husband can't hear it. She said, the other night I'm dancing along and he's looking at me like I'm nuts. And it was that the other night, it was a long way to Tipperary. And of course, these were songs that we had done for sing-alongs back then. Mm-hmm. So, and she said, he finally looked at me and said, what the hell are you doing? And she said, you can't hear that? And he said, no. And I said, have you had these experiences before? Well, yes. And she just very nonchalantly said, my grandmother was the leading medium in London. And I went, oh, okay. And I said, well, she said, I really wish I had a deck of cards. I'd really like to have more information about this man. And I said, well, judging from his voice, do you have any idea of how old he might be? And at first she said no, but then suddenly I think she was getting mental images and impressions. And she went, wait a minute, he's between the age of 50 and 62. And I went, how do you know that? She went, I don't know, I just know. And at that time, I didn't understand that. I do now because of some experiences I've had. And it is just a knowing. Really explain it. But, and then suddenly she started getting more mental impressions. He's 5'10". And then she said he's got a rough complexion and he's balding. And I just let her talk. And he said his hair was thinning. And I said, well, do you have any idea how this man may have died? And at first, again, she didn't know until suddenly something came in where she said, hold on, he had a heart issue when he came on board. So I'm wondering maybe if he died of a heart attack or something. And I said, well, maybe. And she said, hold on, let me just try something. She said, let me move over to my husband's bed and see if I can hear anything there. So she did. She sat and she concentrated. She said, well, I can hear it, but it's not as loud. And I said, well, maybe it's possible he died in your bed.
That's reassuring.
Yeah. And so, the whole time I'm looking at the clock going, I really need to be upstairs right now because there are probably people walking into the show lounge when I'm supposed to be holding them back. And I'm so going to get in trouble for this. But I don't even care because I'm finally having my ghost experience. So at that point, she said, I would really just be interested to know if you had any kind of records of anyone dying in this cabin. I was just curious to know a little bit more about this man. And I said, well, I said, it's very possible there may be records down in the infirmary, but I think most of that stuff goes to the office after a while. And, this ship is very old. So a lot of people have died on the ship, especially with our age bracket on Helen America. I mean, it was not unusual. So, when she made some comment about the deck of cards, I so wanted to run to the library and grab a deck of cards and say, and just completely risk getting fired for not doing my duties. But I thought, no, I really need to get it back upstairs. So on our way back up, I said, do you have any idea if this man is aware that you can hear him? And she just very nonchalantly went, yeah, he knows. And she said, he's very happy and jolly. That's actually why I wanted to find out who this guy was.
He died on vacation. Of course he would be.
He was very happy. There was nothing unnerving about this, her experience. And obviously, because she was psychically sensitive, she did share a couple other stories about having experiences, one of which she said she had a dream that a train crashed that her parents were going to be getting on. The next day she called them and said, don't take the train crashed. Wow. So clearly she was very psychically sensitive and was just, was more curious about what was happening, if there was any other information about the guy. But I did say, I can go down the infirmary and inquire. And she went, oh, no, please don't say anything to anyone. She said, I don't want anyone to think I'm a nut. And I said, no, I get that. I did go down to the infirmary, though, and asked one of the nurses, and she went, well, wow, that's really interesting. And no, we probably don't have any records because they all go to the office. Yeah. But she's like, oh, that was so cool. But I went straight to the Lido after for late night buffet, as we did. And I won't mention names, but I was just buzzing with excitement. And I sat down with the crew staff gang, and I said, you guys, I have the best story for you. And the assistant cruise director at the time, after I told him the story, was so scared. He had to escort him back to his cabin. So it's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. Was that good enough? A little flashback to the past.
Thank you for joining me for today's Captain's Table Conversations with Yvette. Stay tuned for more, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe.